Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on wherever you are. It is Monday at noon Eastern time, so it's time for Live with Kevin. And as is always the case with live television, you never know what's going to happen. I know it's not live television, but it's the closest I'm getting to today. And my guest, who we were supposed to have, who you might be expecting, Erin Meyer, is not here. Don't really know the situation. Won't make any. Hope all is well, of course, for her. So here's what we're going to do. I've got my team looking to see if we can find her. And so I'm checking. We're checking to see if anything's going to happen there. But here's what we're going to do. This may or may not become a episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. But if you aren't aware, you can certainly check out past episodes, 250 some of them, of guests that I've had. At remarkablepodcast.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. So here's what I want you to do. If you are here, I want you to say hello. Go into the comments and say hello. Tell us where you're from. And if you have a question for me about doing podcasts, about being on podcasts, about our new book, The Long Distance Teammate, I'll answer your questions as we wait to see if we have Erin joining us. So but just please do comment in whichever platform you're in. Tell us where you're at, where you're watching from. I'd love to know that. And I will answer any questions. We're going to wait for her for a couple more minutes. And while we're waiting for her and while I'm waiting to hear from you, let me just make a couple of quick comments about some things that I've been thinking about. And probably the single, other than the fact that I'm thinking about the snow that's falling outside, which I happen to love. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about over the last few days is simplicity. I recently completed a course for LinkedIn Learning, which will be coming out in a couple of months, I think, about decision making. And really, ever since I've finished it, I've been thinking about this idea of simplicity, and that oftentimes in organizations, we make things more difficult than they need to be. We make things too hard. Now, there are lots of times when things are, in fact, difficult. But now I see my guest is here. So rather than finishing, well, I'll just finish that comment real quick to say that when we make things too difficult, we might be better off to actually think of the simple solution. Not that we have to implement it, but we at least can consider it. And so now my guest is here. Erin, welcome. Oh, I don't have any.
Oh, now you hear me.
Now I hear you just fine.
Hi, Kevin. So nice to be here with you.
I'm glad to have you here. And so now, everybody, we are going to start. We have our wonderful guest here. Let me start this episode officially. So while you aren't there now, chances are in the recent past, you spent some time watching Netflix. Today, we're not talking about binge watching, but what we can learn about leadership from this innovative company. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can get all future live episodes and therefore interact with us and see them sooner by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Wherever you are, you can do that. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Pretty simple. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate. If you work remotely and want to be more effective, more productive, more engaged, and more connected, this book will help you get there, because there's a big difference between working from home and being an engaged and effective remote teammate. You can learn more and pre-order your copy today. Actually, order your copy now today at longdistanceteammate.com. And with that out of the way, let me introduce to you our guest. Today, it's Erin Meyer. You can see her smiling there. Let me tell you about her, and then we'll dive in and talk about Netflix. Erin is a professor at INSEAD, one of the world's leading international business schools. Her work has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, and Forbes.com. In 2019, she was selected by Thinkers 50 as one of the 50 most influential business thinkers in the world. She received her MBA right there at INSEAD in 2004. She currently lives in Paris, France. In 1994-95, she served in the Peace Corps as a volunteer teacher in South Africa. And she's the author of 2 books that I know of: The Culture Map, Breaking Through the Invisible Boundaries of Global Business. And she's the co-author of her newest book, No Rules Rules, Netflix, and the Culture of Reinvention. Erin, I'm glad to have you. Welcome. Glad you're here.
So nice to be here with you, Kevin. Nice to be with everybody.
So, a culture of reinvention. I'm going to get to that in a couple of minutes. But before we get there, we need to know more about you than just that intro that I read that, you wrote or your mother wrote or somebody wrote. I adjusted a little, but so my question is this: tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you end up doing what you're doing, writing a book with Reed Hastings? Like tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a professor, as you said, at INSEAD, which is this business school outside of Paris, and I study culture in the workplace. So for 2 decades, I was focused almost exclusively on national cultural differences, which is the topic of my first book, The Culture Map. And the story is that my first book came out in 2014, and when it first came out, in the first couple of months, not a lot of people were reading it. I had a small publisher. Took a while to kind of get started passing around. So I woke up one morning and there was an email in my inbox, and the subject line said Peace Corps. And the email said, "Hi, Erin, I was in the Peace Corps near where you were. I read your book and I'm having the leaders in our company read it. My name is Reed and I'm the CEO of Netflix." So I actually didn't think it was real the first time I read it.
So you're like, really? Right?
So in any case, I got to know Netflix and I worked with them as they got ready for their international expansion, and got to know Reed. And then we had this idea to write this book together about their wacky and amazing corporate culture.
And so that's part of what we want to talk about today. So thank you for that. That you didn't wake up one morning and say, "I'm going to be the expert on company culture." I don't imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting because I used to be completely uninterested in corporate culture. So although I was fascinated in understanding the national cultures of the world, I found most corporate cultures to be, at least the way that companies explain them, to be kind of bland and not have anything to do with the way people actually behaved. And then I came across the Netflix culture deck.
I was going to say a little different than bland. We'll get into that in a minute, right?
That's right. So maybe, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, maybe some of your readers are familiar with that deck, but it's because it's been downloaded I think 20 million times now. But when I first read it, it's this deck of slides that explains the Netflix corporate culture. And on the one hand, I really loved, that here was a corporate culture that was interesting and was honest, right? But on the other hand, I have to tell you, Kevin, there were a lot of things about that culture deck that I really found shocking and I didn't like at all. So there's this one slide which says at Netflix, our culture is, or at Netflix, adequate performance gets a generous severance. And when I read that, I thought, well, how could that be? Because all of the research around innovation these days is about psychological safety. So here's this company that's not just ignoring the idea of psychological safety. They're saying, if you don't perform at this super high rate, we'll kick you out the door, right? And then there are these other crazy things in it. It says things like, at Netflix, our vacation policy is take some. And I thought that sounded interesting, but I couldn't imagine how an actual company could operate like that. So that was my introduction to this culture.
So I want to come back to some of those things about as you started to get to know it as an outsider, really. But I want to come back to some of the things that make it different. We'll get to some of the things in the book. But you hinted at this idea of the adequate gives you a severance, basically. And so how is that connected? And what do you even mean by a culture of reinvention?
Yeah. So One of the things that's actually fascinating about Netflix is that, and I think particularly fascinating for our COVID era, is that Netflix is a company that has been able to reinvent themselves multiple times in a period of about 15 years. So this is extremely rare, right? And most companies are not able to change from like one direction to another when the environment shifts. But if you think about it, it was not very long ago that Netflix was a DVD by mail company, right?
I think you can still get them. Isn't that true?
I guess a few people do, right? So they had these, of course, they had these warehouses around the U.S. where they stocked thousands and thousands of DVDs, and they're putting these DVDs every day in the mail to all of their
red
customers.
mailers. I used to get them. All those years ago.
Yeah, my mom did too. Since you brought up my mom, Kevin.
I mean, I'm old, right? I remember, and there's even the story, and I think it's in the book, but I know I've read the story about when Reed and the team went in to try to sell themselves to Blockbuster. Anyone even remember Blockbuster? Some of you that are here live would have to Google that, right?
That's right.
And so they have continued to reinvent themselves. And what would you say, as that outside observer, are some of the things? Obviously, the culture is part of that, but what has enabled them to do what so many aren't able to do?
Yeah, so I interviewed about 200 people at Netflix as I was getting ready for this project, both employees, current and past, and also I interviewed Reed a whole bunch of times. And one of Reed's favorite stories, I need to tell you because it's kind of the basis to the way that this all works. So his first organization was this company called Pure Software. And at the beginning, that was just a group of people that were operating, really entrepreneurial way. So just using their best judgment to make decisions for the good of the organization. But then as the company grew, some people did stupid stuff. Other people took advantage of the freedom given to them. And Reed responded by putting in place a bunch of rules and process, right? So like there was this guy named Jim who used to take the airplane every week from San Francisco to LA. And because there was no travel policy, he started flying first class every week, right? And there were some other people who were like making dumb decisions. So Reed put in place processes like management by objectives and KPIs, right? To make sure that he was minimizing error and increasing efficiency. But then as he did that, as he dummy-proofed the system, eventually what he realized is that only dummies wanted to work there. So the really like creative mavericky employees, they left the company to go work at places that they could like run free, right? And the people who were really good at following those rules and process, they were promoted into those senior positions. So then two things happened. One was that the company stopped innovating. And the other was that as the environment shifted from C++ to Java, the people in charge were not very flexible and they were not able to change direction. And Reed had to sell the company. So with Netflix, his goal was to create a company where people were free, right? A company that operated kind of like on the edge of chaos and gave people lots of freedom to think in fresh and stimulating new ways. So that's the whole basis to this reinvention.
And as you said, people may have downloaded that deck about the company culture at some point, but they've slept since they read it. And by the way, for those of you that are here live, feel free to ask your questions. That's one of the advantages of being here live. You can ask your questions and Erin and I will talk about them. But while people may have read the deck at some point, you've mentioned a couple of things, take vacation when you want to kind of thing. What are some other things about the culture that might surprise people, or that even though they read the deck, right, now that they're talking to someone who's been inside, is that really the way it is? So what might surprise people about the culture?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start by telling you all of the crazy freedoms they have there, and it won't make any sense until we talk about what they've done in order to enable the freedom. So we'll just start there. Okay. So there is no travel policy or expense policy. No approval needed to spend any amount of money. So you just use your judgment to buy what you need to for the organization. The maternity and paternity leave policy is do what's best for you and your family, right? Now, those are like symbols of freedom, but some of the other freedoms I think are actually more interesting, like they don't believe in things like KPIs or management by objective or annual bonuses. Instead, they say they want their employees to feel like they are running free. They don't want the boss's hand to be on the employee's shoulder. And then the really big one is that you don't need approval really for anything at Netflix. So they say don't seek to please your boss and seek to do what's best for the company. And they say lead with context, not control. So
let's talk about that one, because that's one of the things I was hoping we would get to. And since you mentioned it, let's talk about that. What do they mean by, or what is meant by leading by context and not control?
Yeah, so I think we'll start with an image. So in most organizations, the decision-making system is like a pyramid, right? So you have the CEO at the top and the lower level employees at the bottom, right? And the low level employees, they can make small and important decisions. But for any important or big decision, it has to get passed up the pyramid, right? But leadership at Netflix is like a tree. Where they have the chairman who's kind of down there in the dirt, who's setting the context for the organization. So this is our North Star. This is the things we have to keep in mind as we're making decisions. Here are all of the elements that we need to focus on. And then we've got senior management at the lower trunks, right? Setting more context for their divisions. But then it's the lower level managers who are out there like at the small branches, at the leaves of the trees. And those are the people who are making the multi-million-dollar decisions every day, thinking about the context that's been set by their managers, but not needing approval from them to spend that money. And that's what's led to this incredible growth in this company. Because if you think about it, a pyramid can only grow so fast, right? Because you've got a bottleneck at the top. But with a tree, there's really this kind of like endless possibility of growth.
As long as the roots are strong, which takes us back to still the seminal importance of leadership, right? If we want to stay with your metaphor.
That's right. And as long as you have the right employees. And I think that that's where we have to start with all of this. As people, I know you hear this, you must be just like me, everyone. When I heard all of this, I thought, well, that sounds really romantic, but I have no idea how that could actually function. So I don't believe it. Right? But now,
200 interviews in and a book published with your name on it, what do you say?
Well,
is it real?
Yeah, it's real, but it only works because of the foundational principles, right? And so maybe we'll come back later to like more with lead with context, not control, but kind of talk a little bit about the principles now. Is that fine?
Actually, in just a second, because we have a question that came in.
Let's do it.
Hear that question, and I'm going to put it up here. The question is about ways to breakthrough innovation in an engineering institution, which happens to be a university. So you know a little bit about that as well. So do you have any thoughts about which gets at where I wanted to end our whole conversation, which, okay, I'm not at Netflix, right? Thank you so much, Erin. But talk to me about what I do. So let's answer Madhav's specific question. You have any thoughts about that? Or what sort of like, what would Reed do? What would Reed say if we were wearing that on a wristband?
Yeah, so this is actually, hello, Madhav, so nice to meet you. This is actually a great question, I think, to just jump into these principles, because my goal with all of this was not to like write a book about what a crazy, weird place to work. Although, I mean, I guess that's part of what comes out of it, but to really come up with some like useful ideas about what other organizations or universities, if you work at a university like I do, could do around the world to improve innovation. So yeah, let's dive in, Madhav, and I hope in 15 minutes we'll have a like really thorough answer of your question. So as Reed, was thinking about how to create this organization where he would give employees a lot of freedom, and the freedom would then breed innovation, right? He thought, well, the problem is that as the company grows, complexity increases, and if you don't put in place these processes, the whole organization is going to descend into mayhem, right? But then he realized, well, in most organizations, the best employees don't need rules and process. It's those employees that are a little bit less amazing that we put those rules and processes in place for. So what if we were going to create an organization that was made up only of top performers, right? And so already we could have a lot less rules and process, and we could talk more about that in a few minutes. And then what if we also tried to create a culture of a lot of candid feedback, right? Where we were really, telling one another all the time what we could do to improve, which would increase our talent density and mean we need less rules. Plus, if people try to take advantage of the freedom, we'd call one another out, which would create a co-accountability, right? So if we did those two things, then we could really go to this place where we would let go of all of those policies and rules. And I think just that simple kind of 3-step process is actually something that we can think about in any organization where we're looking for more innovation.
Yeah, so I love that because, and I want to get to the feedback piece a little bit more. It's one of the things that I had that I wanted us to talk about. So in most organizations, there isn't much feedback, or what people get is too late, and likely too little too late, and not always even from the right people. So talk about that a little bit more, because I love how you put that, Erin, in the context of how it fits into everything else. But talk about the specifics of how of what Netflix has learned about the feedback process.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because a lot of organizations, especially in the US, right, are talking today about feedback, about trying to develop a feedback culture, but they don't seem to be getting that far with it. And at Netflix, I can tell you, people are really candid. Right? We have some stories about that. But what I've seen in my own research is that most people recognize the value of candid feedback, but they don't get it, right? And that's because of the amygdala. So the amygdala is the most primitive part of your brain. And the amygdala is very concerned with not getting kicked out of the tribe, right? It's finding safety in numbers. So if someone actually dares to give you negative feedback, to tell you what you could do to improve your performance, your amygdala starts sending off an alarm, right? And when that happens, you're likely to respond with fight or flight. So either I deny it, no, it's not me, it's you, right? Or I flee, I don't want to talk to you anymore, right? But they've done some very simple things at Netflix just to get the feedback out there. So one is just like kind of obvious, but they do a lot of these putting feedback on the agenda. So frequently, like if you and I meet, Kevin, every month, the first item of the meeting or the last item of the meeting will be, feedback. And you'll tell me what I can do to improve my performance, and I'll tell you, right? So just getting that out there, I think, is very useful. But they also do some really like edgy stuff that I thought was crazy when I first heard about it. So
let's just, before you go there, let's just say that. So what Erin is saying, everybody, and you can, and what I love about this is you don't have to have this as a whole organizational culture. If you're saying, well, this is awesome, right? But I'm not at Netflix, right? So what? As a leader, you can put feedback on the agenda of your one-on-ones. For me, it's at the end of each one, but it doesn't matter where, right? So the point is you have more control in this than you might think. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I think thinking about leaders, it's not just a question of putting feedback on the agenda with our employees. It's also encouraging our employees to put feedback on the agenda with one another, exactly. Right?
Yeah, I was starting with one step, but you're exactly right. So take us to some of the edgier stuff.
Yeah. Oh, but let me say one other thing. Maybe that is part of the edgy stuff. But if we're going to put feedback on the agenda with me and my employees, what I need to focus on is not me giving them feedback, but them giving me feedback first, right?
Right.
Because
Asking for it, right?
that's right. Because an organization that can manage to get employees to give feedback to leadership, I mean, that's where our amygdalas get really concerned, right? If the boss, if the boss tells me he wants feedback from him, well, I start thinking, if I really give it to him, gosh, am I going to get kicked off of this team? Right. But if the boss is really encouraging and enthusiastic and celebrates it when she gets it, then after a while, the employees start to see, oh, okay, this is really serious. And if I give that feedback, then it's going to be appreciated. Right. I'm not going to get kicked out. I'm going to get promoted. Right. And then, the really crazy one is that they do these 360-degree feedback dinners. Which is where that they get together about once a year and over a meal, right, over several hours. And one person's up first and they go around the table and each person at the table so like I'm first. So we'll go around the table and Kevin, you'll tell me something that I can do to improve my performance, right? And then we go on to the next person and then on to the next person. And the first time I heard this, I just thought, well, what's the point? Right? Like, why would you drag my weaknesses out in front of the whole group? I mean, can't you tell me that in private? But I saw it's actually this incredible mechanism because it gets rid of all of this whispering that happens at most companies where we're all saying, oh, did you see what that person did? And did you see that presentation? It just gets it all out there. And in addition, when we're giving it as a team like that, I can see, when that one person gave me feedback, that was really more about her and me. But this other thing, everyone's talking about it. So I really see that's what I need to work on.
It's harder for me to ignore it if I heard it 4 times.
That's right.
Some of us still will, but at Netflix, you might not be there long. And of course, feedback isn't just negative, but also positive, and both show up in that moment, right? So
well, they do, right? But I would say, one of the things they really focus on at Netflix is that, of course, our human tendency is to want to praise one another and praise one another a lot, right? And of course, this is also biological. When we praise one another, we get chemicals released in our brain that make us feel great. So why wouldn't we want to get together and tell one another a lot of wonderful things about one another? So what they say at Netflix is that feedback, you can say some actionable positive feedback, like please continue this, but you should keep that to 25%. And 75% should really be focused on what you can do to help that person improve, right? Those actionable items that can really assist that person to do better.
Absolutely. And the point I wanted to make was I wanted to get you to talk about that percentage. And I wanted to get to the point is that so often people, even though we do like praising each other, at work, most of the feedback we do get is negative. And so often that word gets tainted as only negative. That's why I wanted you to talk to that. So anything else? You've talked about several sort of very practical things, but, pretty much no one else that's here is at Netflix, chances are, or watching or listening. So the question would be, what other advice do you have for anyone else, any of us, who aren't at Netflix, other than buying the book? And we'll talk about that before we're done. What other advice would you give to people to applying these ideas in a place that's not normal?
Yeah. So we jumped to candor, but I actually want to move back and say that the foundation to all of this, which is, I think, like the main thing, is that if you want to give your employees a lot of freedom, which then breeds innovation and flexibility, that you have to get the best performers on your team. And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, well, that's fine for Netflix because they have a lot of money, but what about me? So I want to be kind of actionable and get people to to think about why this is so important and also how it can apply to you. So the first principle to high performing teamwork that I learned from Netflix is what they call the rockstar principle. And the rockstar principle is based on research that I guess most software engineers know, which shows that one top software engineer will provide more value than 10 to 25 medium software engineers. So if you have a bucket of money, then you could hire like 25 medium engineers, or you could pool that money together and hire one rock star. Right. And that's what Reed's idea was with, because he's an engineer, his idea was to apply that to all creative roles at Netflix. So whether it was, marketing or choosing the next shows or, really anything in that arena, in that company, he was going to hire the best and pool the money together to have a lot less employees. So I think actually it's a very interesting idea. Even if you're only 20, a company of 20, you can think, well, maybe instead of hiring 3 people, I'll try to just hire one, but really get the best for all of the money I have. And
Right.
because then you can give that person more freedom, which leads to more innovation, right?
It relates to a question that came in from Russell. So let me show it to you. Russell says, so what are the characteristics that Netflix is looking for in ideal employees and leaders? And what do they do differently to hire them? You want to talk about that for just a sec?
Yep. So okay. So I know it sounds horrible. I mean, I got to tell you, it shocked me. It's horrible. This whole adequate performance gets a generous severance, but it's a very interesting idea. I think what they do at Netflix, which is something that they call the keeper test. And I really do believe that any manager should at least use this self-test to consider their team. So the test is that every 6 months or a year, you just sit down by yourself and you imagine that each person on your team comes to you and tells you that they're leaving. So like, Kevin or Russell, you come into my office and you say, Russell, Erin, I really enjoyed working here, but I'm leaving the company. I have another job offer, right? And then I think, how would I feel if Russell told me that he was leaving? Would I be devastated? Would I think, oh my gosh, Russell, don't leave me, right? Would I fight to keep him?
And he's a keeper, right?
And if I would, okay, Russell, to come to your question, there are no other rules about this, low rules. The only rule is if I would fight to keep you, then I know you're the right person on this team. Would I feel a little bit relieved? I'm sure if it were you, I would not, Russell, but maybe someone else.
This is hypothetical at this point, Russell.
Would I feel a little bit relieved? Like, would I think, oh, good, now I don't have to deal with those problems? Or would I maybe even feel excited thinking about like who I could get with that money? And if so, then you have to ask yourself the question, have I been candid? Have I given that person a lot of clear, candid feedback about how to up their performance? And if I haven't, well, then I have to go do it right now. But if I have, and I've seen, they're not gonna get there to the point that I would fight to keep them. Well, then you really need to make some tough decisions. And I think, that's just the basis of this whole idea. You use the keeper test. Adequate performance gets a generous severance. You then get these stunning teams where you can give people a lot of freedom to innovate and be flexible and achieve great things.
There's some feedback and a little more feedback, even though we're going to say this is in the 25% component right there, that, you're getting some positive feedback, Erin. So a couple of things before we finish up. And I knew before we started that we could have had a long conversation, but I just have a couple of other quick questions for you. And one of them is this. In your work, and I'm kind of taking us back from the book now a little bit, maybe not, but as in your seat, as an author, in your seat in working with organizations, and your seat in Paris, France, my question is, what do you see as the future of work?
Yeah. So this is my most important overriding lesson from the work that I did at Netflix, which is that the majority of organizations today are operating with this, let's say, like industrial era hangover. And what I mean by that is that, during the industrial era, of course, we had this strong focus on error prevention, consistency, and replicability, right? And in some organizations today, of course, those are still the goals. But in a growing number of organizations today, our big thing, our most important element is no longer error prevention, it's innovation. And instead of replication, we need flexibility, exactly the opposite, right? But so many companies are still focused on putting in place to maximize efficiency and minimize error. So I really learned, that here's one company that's operating for the future. And I think there's so much that we can think about how to do things differently in these organizations.
It leads to a point that we don't have time to unveil, but I will leave for all of you to think about. And that is finding that balance between innovation and error prevention, if you want to think about it that way. Because we still need some error, like even at Netflix, like when I click the right button, the right movie's got to show up, right? So that still exists. So the challenge for us as leaders in the future, I think in many cases, is finding the right balance for the work that we're leading. So, and we don't really have time to unlock that, but do you have a comment you want to make about that?
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. Like if we think about our organizations, like I work with Michelin Tires here in Paris, here in France, and part of their organization, of course, is focused on error prevention, right? And we hope so because we're using their tires, right? So it's a safety critical market. They really need to make sure that everything is exactly right in their product. If we have an error, it might lead to death. They also, of course, are they have these products in these factories where they need lots of process. But so there we can stick to the rules and process we've used for hundreds of years. But in other parts of Michelin, they're trying to dream up new ways of creating tires, of new things that no one has ever thought of. And there they need to think about, okay, how can we get rid of these rules and process? Instead, try to get these really like creative, fantastic employees, and then get a lot of candor going, and then see that innovation happening because we have no rules telling people what to do. So I hope that, that lots of people will take not just lessons for their entire organization, but maybe even for one department out of this.
Exactly right. So, all right, we'll talk about the book one more time, I promise, Erin. But right now, people want to know about you. So, what does Erin do for fun?
I rollerblade. I rollerblade for fun. I rollerblade because I lived just outside of Paris. I rollerblade around Longchamp, which is the famous horse racing area outside of Paris. You can find me there in the afternoons.
That's good. And where I would be falling, you're still blading. So that's good. Now, there's a question, Erin, that since we didn't have a chance to talk before we went live, there's a question that I normally tell people I'm going to ask, and I'm not telling you, but I'm going to ask you anyway. So what's something that you're reading or that you've read recently? I don't care what it is. What's something that you're reading that people might find interesting?
Oh, the only thing that I'm reading lately is a lot of books to my children. So Big Nate, we're really into Big Nate. And Captain Underpants.
Okay, my son, I remember the Captain Underpants. So these will be, by the way, everybody, this will be the first time that we'll be putting Big Nate and Captain Underpants in the show notes. But that's where you can always find more about what we've done today, whether you're with us live or with us later. So I know we have another question that's come in, but we're really not going to have time for that. And I apologize. But I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
And that's the question that you've been wanting me to ask from the beginning. Where can people find out more about this book, and where can they find out more about you?
Yes, so please join me on LinkedIn, where I post frequently. You can join me at erinmeyer.com. It was really a pleasure to be here with you, Kevin, and I hope that I get to see all your listeners face to face next time.
And the book is, say the book's title again.
Oh,
Is that what we did? All right. No rules.
No rules, Netflix and the Culture of Reinvention. And I should clarify, it's not no rules. It's no rules.
Well, there you go, everybody. And now a question for all of you that are watching or listening, whether it's live with us now or whether it's later on the podcast. And that is, now what? What are you going to take from this? And this is at the heart of what something Erin said earlier. This isn't really about just learning something about Netflix. This is about learning what I can do differently. So what ideas did you get? What insights did you get that you now need to translate into your work as a leader and a team member? So Erin, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you. Much, and everybody, we'll be back here. Every week there's a new episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So we hope you'll find us. And every week we're right here live. Some weeks it's a podcast. Some weeks it's not. Wherever you're watching live, we'll be back. And we'll be back again, as I said, next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.